Based on my observations and 20 years experience helping students prepare for the Cambridge English exams, it's the writing paper that people really struggle with the most. In fact, I would say that in about 80% of the results statements that I see from students who have taken the exams, this writing paper is the lowest score of all. And that can make a big difference. It can be the difference between a pass and a fail, or it could be the difference between an A and a B or a B and a C. And actually it's not that difficult to get a few extra marks just by avoiding some of the most common mistakes that students make. So in this video, I'm going to share the top 10 most common mistakes that students make in the writing paper of the Cambridge English exams, whether that's the B2 First, C1 Advanced or C2 Proficiency. So I'm going to start with number 10 and then finish with number 1, which I believe is the most common mistake that students make, and it may come as a surprise to you. But I'm going to give you a clue to what number 1 is by sharing this quote from Abraham Lincoln. "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." So I'm not going to explain that quote now. You probably understand it, but when we get to number 1, you'll see why I've chosen to share that quote. Okay, but let's start with number 10, bad punctuation. Now, this is quite a common mistake, but you may be a little bit surprised that it's not further up the list, that it's only at number 10. But I've put it at number 10 because there is no marking criterion which specifically evaluates punctuation. Now, it's very useful when writing any composition for the Cambridge English exams to keep in mind the marking criteria that the examiners look at, which is content, communicative achievement, organization, and language. Now, punctuation, it would be included in the organization criterion because bad punctuation can really affect the flow of the text. It can be quite difficult to read a composition which is badly punctuated. And really, when I'm talking about punctuation, I'm really referring to the use of the comma, because really in most texts you don't need to use a lot of punctuation. It's really the comma and the full stop, and I think you all know how to use the full stop. And I've made a couple of videos already on how to use the comma, which I'll link to in the description to this video, but it's really worth paying attention because, as I said, a badly punctuated essay, for example, is very difficult to read and you could potentially lose marks. Okay, number 9 now is not linking ideas. So what do I mean by this? Well, I see many essays, for example, where you may have a paragraph which includes maybe 7 or 8 very short and basic sentences, but there's no linking of ideas. So that it will just be one sentence with one idea, then another idea, then another idea. You can use connectors or cohesive devices. You can use basic linkers like and, but, and because. That's okay if they're appropriate. Or you can use more advanced cohesive devices like furthermore, in addition, however, nonetheless, nevertheless. It's also a good idea to use relative clauses, so either defining or non-defining relative clauses to link ideas rather than lots of short sentences. Again, I've made a couple of videos on relative clauses, which I'll share in this video description, and also in my grammar course I go into a lot of detail on clauses. It's one of the modules in my grammar course. Okay, moving on to number 8 now, and that's including irrelevant content in your composition. So this is related to the content criterion, of course, and it's very important to only do the task which is set. Don't include any extra information that is not specifically asked for in the task. Now, in the instructions to the task, Cambridge offer a guide to the word length that you should use for the composition, but it is only a guide. You should get quite close to that guide, but it's not a strict limit. But if you write too many words, it's very possible that you have included some irrelevant content and you will be penalized for that. So be careful, pay attention to the task and do not include any irrelevant content. Which leads me on to number 7 now, which is not completing the task. So this is a very common mistake. That students don't pay enough attention to the task and they don't do everything that is asked in the task. Often there are many aspects to the task, as you can see from this example. And if you're not really paying attention, in fact, I recommend you underline the different aspects of the task. But if you're not paying attention, there is the danger that you won't really complete the task and the examiners will consider that the target reader is not fully informed. And again, you will be penalized for that. So it's this balance between completing the task, doing everything that is asked of you, but not doing too much, not including irrelevant content. And if you can do that, make sure the target reader is fully informed and that you haven't included any irrelevant content. You should get 5 out of 5 for the content criterion. Okay, moving on to number 6 now, and this is not following the conventions of the task. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're writing an essay, for example, you must follow the conventions of essay writing. So you must include an introductory paragraph, 2 or 3 main body paragraphs, and a conclusion paragraph. If you're writing a letter, you should start the letter in an appropriate way and finish the letter in an appropriate way, and just generally follow the conventions of letter writing. If you're writing a report or a proposal, you should have a title and subheadings for each section. Those are the conventions of report writing. If you're writing an article, the style should be quite engaging, and it should not feel like the target reader is reading an essay if you're writing an article. So there should be a clear difference between the different tasks. There are different styles of writing, and that should be represented. And so you should follow the conventions of the specific task. Again, in my online course, I go into a lot of detail on how to do that. But a lot of it is just common sense. You think if you read articles in your own language even, then you should know how to write an article. If you read reviews, you should know how to write a review. And again, this leads on to point number 5, which is using an inappropriate register. Now, I see this a lot, again, that students don't use the appropriate register, so the level of formality for the task. With an essay, it's always the same. You should use from a neutral to a formal register. With the other tasks, the part 2 tasks, it will always depend on the target reader. If you have to write a letter to an institution or somebody you don't know, then it should be in quite a formal register. If you're writing a letter to a friend, of course, then you should use an informal register. Again, that's quite obvious and it's common sense, but sometimes it's not that clear. If you have to write an article for a magazine, it may depend on the type of magazine you're writing an article for. You must identify the register that you need to use and be consistent throughout your composition. Again, this is a big mistake when students use some really formal vocabulary in one sentence and then quite a colloquial expression in another sentence. And again, you will be penalized for that because you must be consistent with the register throughout and use an appropriate register. Okay, mistake number 4 now, and now we're starting to get into the really common mistakes that students make. It's not using a wide range of vocabulary. So this is an exam, and you need to be trying to demonstrate your level and demonstrate and use the vocabulary you know. So don't repeat vocabulary, try to avoid repetition. Sometimes you need to repeat vocabulary, sometimes it's impossible to find a synonym. That's okay, but in general, try to avoid repetition. And also, if you write an adjective and you feel it's quite a basic adjective, just spend a few seconds trying to come up with a more advanced synonym. You do want to try to impress the examiners. That is part of what taking an exam is. So try to come up with synonyms, more impressive, more sophisticated vocabulary. Sometimes you'll need to use basic vocabulary. That's okay. You need to use a mix. But in order to get 5 out of 5 in the language criterion, the examiners are looking for some less common lexis used in the composition. Again, it must be appropriate. A mistake that students make is sometimes just throwing in lots of really advanced words and expressions, but they're not really appropriate for the text or for the context. So yes, try to come up with more advanced vocabulary and a wide range, but it must be appropriate and fit with the register too. So as I said, that's related to the language criterion, as is number 3, which is not using a wide range of grammatical structures. So again, in the language criterion, the examiners look at the grammar and the vocabulary you use, and a big mistake that students make is using very limited grammar. So again, this is an exam. You want to demonstrate how much grammar you know, and to be able to use it appropriately in the right context to express your ideas. So perhaps think when you're writing a sentence, could I express this idea using some advanced structures? So maybe I could use inversion, or maybe I could use a cleft sentence, or maybe I could use the conditional. You don't need to literally include every advanced grammatical structure you know in one composition, but just think, again, how can I make this sentence a little bit more sophisticated and advanced, but again, in an appropriate way. So keep the grammar in mind when you're writing your composition. Okay, so now we're into the top 2 of the most common mistakes that I notice students making. As I said, you may be surprised by number 1, but you may also be a little bit surprised by number 2, which is just simply not checking your composition when you've finished. I really recommend you just give yourself a few minutes at the end. Try to organize your time, manage your time so that you leave yourself a few minutes at the end just to check your composition and correct these silly little mistakes that almost everybody makes. Manage your time well and give yourself a few minutes at the end to check and eradicate some of those really basic mistakes. Okay, so here we are at number 1, the most common mistake that I've observed students make over my 20 years experience helping students prepare for the exam. Have you guessed it from the quote, the Abraham Lincoln quote earlier? You may well have done. Well, it's a lack of planning before you start writing your composition. Now, this is number 1 because I know that most of you, most students who take the exam don't plan their writings before they start literally writing the composition. You could plan what type of vocabulary you want to use, what grammar structures, the organization of the text, the content you're going to include, the way you link ideas. It would really be much easier and quicker to write the text if you dedicate a few minutes before you start writing. Now, in my online preparation courses, I actually recommend that you spend about 15 minutes of the 45 minutes you have in total, or 40 minutes for the B2 first, but 15 minutes planning your composition before you even start writing it. Now, I think nobody does that, but I honestly think it's good advice because the more time you spend planning, the less time you'll need to write, and the fewer mistakes you'll make too. And I promise you'll find it much easier. Okay, so those are my top 10 most common mistakes that students make in the writing paper. But I want to finish with one big tip, which is probably bigger than all the other tips I've given in this video. And that is, you must practice. You must practice before the exam. If the first time you write an essay is on the day of the exam, or the first time you write a report or a letter or a review or an article is on the day of the exam, you're going to struggle. You're going to struggle with how to structure your essay. You're going to struggle with the vocabulary, the grammar. So practice. If you feel embarrassed, you don't have to show it to anybody, but just write and go through the process more or less within the time. I mean, the first time you practice, you're not going to do it in 45 minutes, but the more you practice, the more automatic it will become, and you'll be able to write your compositions more quickly. So you really must practice. I know you don't want to, but it's time to bite the bullet. Okay, did I miss anything? Are there any mistakes that you make that I haven't mentioned? Share them in the comments because you'll be helping other students who are preparing for the Cambridge English exams. And I'll see you very soon for another video.